record, because so later on people can play this if they want to. And the nice thing about it, if you play it later, we'll have it on YouTube, and you can slow it down. So I don't seem always to take my words and smash them into one single word. By the way, if you don't know me, I'm Bruce Calder. I am the VP Consulting Services here at Ekiden. That's an emoji my daughter made of me, which is probably one of the more flattering pictures of me, so I'll definitely take it. We're going to talk about an update on the ECA guidance from June of this year on SCIP, and really talk practical side. There are guidance and additional guidance we'll talk about, but we're going to talk more about some of the practical side of it. Definitely, the practical part is really important. We've done literally thousands of SCIP declarations already, worked for dozens of companies. There's a real practical aspect of this, and we have a lot of experience on how you handle different situations and how to leverage what you do have and don't be burdened by what you don't have. There's a lot of ways to do it. So we're going to talk about a lot of fundamental processes behind it to implement, and of course the variations on it. Depending your product and your situation, there are perfectly practical, rational variations on the approach that make a lot of sense. So we're going to do a little intro, and which I'm kind of doing right now. So then we're going to talk a little bit about ECA and interpretations and rulings on SCIP, what they can give interpretations on and what they cannot. And hopefully that provides a little more context why a lot of things are recommendations, or they're not quite written in stone, or these parts are really important and these parts there are more options around them, and why there's sometimes less lack of specificity in certain guidance. And we're going to talk about one of the main concepts they talk about is the quasi-identical complex objects, which we've called component grouping forever. The idea of what are the rules about grouping components of the same SVHCs together, and give you some examples, but also product grouping. So I have a green coffee machine, a red coffee machine, a black coffee machine, and they all have the same SVHCs. Can I group them together? And the answer is yes, but there are some limitations. So consumer products have more rules than professional products. So there's a little bit difference. We're going to talk about location identification, the recommendation, and a lot of the examples by ECA about here's a car with an engine, with a water pump, and an O-ring, and is that important, required, or recommended? And it's just recommended. We talk directly, the key legal requirement is the product, the component, and the SVHC in that component, plus some ancillary database information around that. We'll talk about distributor notification, which is a bit of the post-submission work burden, where distributors of a product don't have to submit themselves the SCIP file, but they do need the SCIP number. Currently, I can see pushback on this, and have to submit your number under their ID. So they will have to register in the system, which is really easy to do, and then each product they sell with an SVHC and a component over 0.1% by weight, they have to register that number of that product, basically get it from the manufacturer into the system. We'll talk about that and the requirements and when you do and when you don't and what's the practical way to do it. And then we'll talk about a simplified compliance process. It's not one size fits all, but it handles all the different variations we've come across. So it's a really good way to do it. And variation, not just in product and business, but very much in the way you're structured. Corporate groups versus business units, some business units more enabled than others, and how you manage that. Of course, what do? We're one of the biggest test labs in North America. Testing is by far the most complete way to handle any of the restricted materials, but it's not always possible, especially for legacy products. We'll talk about a lot of practical applications. Definitely we're talking about today down at the bottom, SCIP web demonstration and templates are super popular right now. And it's what we really do. We sit down, explain the rules, explain the process, and then we take one of your products with you. If it's very small, people often send it to us. We use our camera system and we walk through your product with you and explain the parts and show you the parts that are going to have SVHCs and which ones are not and why, and really make it tangible. If it's a larger product, we do it from pictures. It's really straightforward. We take your pictures. The new smart phone cameras are amazingly high resolution. We can actually zoom in very easily and walk you, usually do left to right, through the product on what parts are potentially SVHC containing and how you declare them. And then we're actually going to create a product template for SCIP in Excel, and then a component. We're going to provide you component templates. The component templates are far more technical. We'll explain them a little bit here, and we'll build them beforehand. And put the Excel files together, which isn't iEuclid, but Excel is much more tangible for normal folk. And then we build it into an iEuclid file with you. And then from that process, you'll be enabled to create all of your own. However, depending on resources, we're here to support you. We can answer questions. Or a lot of cases, this business unit wants to do it themselves. They'll ask a couple of questions. This business unit just wants somebody else to do it. And since we're all aligned on the same process, it's really easy for us to do it for you. And you don't necessarily have to commit one way or another. You have the tools. If the tools are good for you, then great. If you need us to help, we're using the same tools. So it's pretty easy for us to jump in whenever. And of course, related to like what we're doing today on education, super popular. We do it for about 70 or 80 companies. Monthly or quarterly updates where we sit down, either month or every quarter, and explain the changes in restricted materials and how it applies to your products. A good example this month, we're talking about the 4 new REACH SVHCs, and we explain why the 5th one didn't get on yet, but it'll probably be on in 2 years. And then the 4 new ones, this is what they are. This is why they're not going to be in your product above 0.1% by weight. Here's the one that is going to be debate, because some people will think it's in PVC, but it's not. It's really polyurethane coatings. It'll explain why the residual amount in coatings, it won't be a declarable SVHC. We'll talk about the new Canadian restricted substances coming up in the next little while. We'll talk about the PFOA restriction, and we'll also talk very practical. So in the test lab, the PFOA is coming up in these materials, and this is the ones that are being non-compliant. And it's interactive, and you ask questions, and you give feedback, and you say, well, my customer's asking for this. Okay, well, this is what they really need, and really explain things. Or next month, you know what, it'd be really nice if you could give us an update on biocides or explain biocides, because we have no idea. We've been asked about it, and we just have no idea. Or can you give us, a medical company, we're being asked about nanomaterial compliance, can you explain? And so we do that. So really popular, very easy, just contact us. We do so much of this. Very happy to help. One of the original sparks that definitely got us going a decade ago is, we're looking at how people are doing restricted materials compliance. And we thought, you know what, there's got to be a better way to do this. And one of the fundamental philosophies behind this is there is a better way. There's always a better way. And it's not one answer for a lot of things, actually. And sometimes the better way are ways that are also adaptable. That's very, very important, because it's if you're stuck inside the box and the product doesn't fit inside the box, then it doesn't really work. So we're always a big fan. You'll see the SCIP stuff we talk about. There's always a better way. You'll see the way we do lab testing. There's just a better way to handle a lot of these substances. And we're always a big fan. There is a better way. And that's actually why a lot of companies come to us eventually. It's like, you know what, this actually kind of makes more sense. And so that's what we try to focus on. We're not trying to ram square pegs in round holes. There's usually a better way to do things. And better way often means adaptable. You're not trying to jam. Things don't fit into the box. You really need an idea as how do you change the box to fit the product. So we're talking today primarily about SCIP, substance of concern in articles as are such in complex objects products. SCIP, manufacturers of products that contain an SVHC above 0.1% by weight and any component in the product need the product, the component, and the SVHC registered in the system by Jan 5th, 2021. There's a prototype system out right now, but it's not the registration system. But even when the final version comes out, it's still 2 different systems, even though they might be under the same umbrella. One is a system that it creates the iEuclid files, these dossiers. It creates an I6Z file that you can transport or upload into the registration system. And you literally can email it to somebody. You can drag drop it in the registration system. The registration component will be a different part of the system. Pretty easy though. It's a matter of just uploading it. Drag drop, you literally can actually go into your folder on your desktop, drag it and drop it into the system. So you can pick up 20 files, drag it in and drop it. So what's open today is both the web and offline version that you can create the I6Z files. So we're going to talk a lot about creating those files. The registration itself is relatively straightforward. Once the files are created and they meet the requirements, they get redragged right into the final registration system come later this year. And that they get registered from that. When you register them, you get a SCIP number. The SCIP number is what you'll provide others when they request it. We'll explain all about that in a little bit. So key thing about guidance from ECHA. So what I'm talking about is a lot of guidance from them. Do realize ECHA is responsible for implementation of the software. The legal interpretation of REACH SVHC is not under ECHA's mandate. For the most part, they do actually have a mandate to create guidances to different sections. So the guidance on articles for REACH is part of their mandate. And so there's a variety inside that guidance document is things have been approved to do. But otherwise, interpretations of REACH SVHCs is not part of their mandate. This originally comes from the implementation of ROHS recast, believe it or not. When they're implementing ROHS recast, one of the things that came out of it is that the EU Commission and the various branches of government have no legal standing on interpretation. It's actually right in the ROHS 2 FAQ, but it's also in all the lead-up documents going into ROHS recast. ROHS 2 FAQ says, that's why it's also, by the way, an FAQ instead of a guidance. These FAQ reflect the views, the DG environment, which is another part of the European government. ECHA, some are standalone, but they're both part of the EU government, and as such are not legally binding. Binding interpretation of EU legislation is the exclusive competence of the Court of Justice of the European Union. So what they're saying is that text should be self-explanatory, and any interpretation is only the purview of the Court of Justice of the European Union. So in 2015, when it got taken to court on what was the definition of an article for REACH SVHC, and the Court of Justice, European Court of Justice, ruled, ECJ, that it was at the component level, not the product level, that is binding. And that's a big part of this. And we'll talk about examples later where that's also really important. So an opinion from the Court of Justice is what's binding. The guidance from ECHA are mostly recommendations, except they own the software. So the software fields are their responsibility. In terms of how you fill those in and what is a REACH declarable SVHC is not part of that. So again, how does that apply to SCIP? ECHA is responsible for the software. Legal interpretation of REACH SVHC is not under their mandate. So many items that they'll provide are actually recommendations. They would like you to do it this way. They'd like you to go car, engine, water pump, O-ring, but it's not the legal requirement. Requirement is the product, the component, and the SVHC. Enforcement is also only the purview of the EU member states. Enforcement is not the purview of ECHA. However, the ECHA software can reject a submission because the fields are not filled in correctly. That's software. But the actual enforcement of your declarations from the EU member states, the EU Commission. Legal interpretations come from the European Court of Justice. So as we talk about, there's some need to navigate between mandatory and recommended. And also realize that the main legal requirement is to submit. Errors in the submission, especially early on, as long as you've done it in good faith. So don't be scamming the system, but as long as you do it in good faith, there's really no punishment for it. The worst is, next year, can you change this? But, we're happy you're in the system because not everybody's done yet. And that's going to be a big part of it. And you think, how important is that going to be? Numbers are important. One of the most interesting things in politics is how successful a new potential candidate is often is either poll numbers or finance. How much money have they raised in financing? ECHA will be wanting to promote how many companies have registered. So their success is very much around how many companies have submitted and how many products have submitted. So as long as you're doing it in good faith, there's a lot of leeway up front. So realize one of the big differences in recommendation and also the way they're going to be motivated next year is that they basically say, hey, only like 12 companies are registered. We have 1,500 products. It's not going to be good for them. So they are going to talk about, they even tweet about it. They have actually quite informative Twitter account, but they're going to want to say, like they did for chemical dossiers, we have 100,000 chemical dossiers or whichever. They're very motivated to do that. So the big legal requirement for this is to submit. As long as you do in good faith, a interpretive variation in your submission is not going to cause a penalty. So that's a big part of this. Okay, so a good example of their limitations. So this one comes up all the time. Lead in leaded glass in thick film resistors is leaded glass. It is an unknown and variable composition of biological. It has its own chemical number. It is a different chemical from lead metal or lead oxide. So even though the lead in the lead oxide is what's used to create the glass in the thick film resistor, it's leaded glass at the end of the day. It's a different CAS number than lead or lead oxide, so they're not SVHCs. So if you have a thick film resistor and somebody reports lead in or lead oxide, those are not declarable SVHCs, actually. It's leaded glass. Everybody like, well, has ECHA stated that? Well, ECHA they know they don't have a legal standing for those interpretations. They're not allowed to. So what instead is the EU Glass Alliance went out and got a legal opinion, which is a pretty good idea. And then industry, the Germans and the Japanese agreed on it, and they published, we agree, and now it's commonly used. Now, this is a bit of the gold standard. It's not an interpretation of ECA, but they do not provide interpretations. But this is about as good as you're going to get. All related to that, you're almost never going to get anything this good. So this is probably the best example of done completely, but as Loctite as you can get. And the thing is, if they're wrong, they're all wrong together. We're a big fan of hanging together instead of hanging separately. If you're going to be wrong in good company. So there's really no penalty for that. And so a lot of what we're talking about, what we do is same things be done by dozens of other companies and for thousands of, tens of thousands of products. And the worst thing that's going to happen, as long as you submit in good faith, don't be gaming the system. There's no real penalty as long as you submit, and they're going to promote the fact that it's submitted. They're not going to promote, well, we think the data is useless. That is 100% not going to happen. So, update on the ECA guidance. So this is a lot of what we're going to talk about today is from the SCIP IT user group of June 11th, 2020. It's going to follow along. It's one of the people this morning said, is this kind of the same thing you presented a month ago? Yeah, it is in a lot of ways because we have a pretty good idea they're going to go this way. They didn't say it, but it's the only thing that made sense. This is actually using a lot more of the language and referencing more of their particular guidance. So they're still learning, and we have a pretty good idea each way they're going to go because ECA and their infinite wisdom hasn't done many submissions. We've probably done 100 times as many as they have. They're going to learn a lot, and they're going to realize that, and they're starting to realize that there are some practical elements to this. So one of the things they talk about is quasi-identical complex objects, which we've been calling component or product grouping for months. And it's the way we do it. The idea of grouping similar products or similar components into a single listing instead of listing every single one separately. And so they talk about it. One of the good examples, they use bolts and O-rings, and it's wonderful examples. We've been using forever. A good example for us is brass components, where the average, especially electronic product, has a lot of lead and brass, exemption 6C under ROHS, super common, all over the place, in connectors and standoffs and this, that, the other thing. But they're all just lead and brass components. And listing every single one, especially to make a system, like some of the ones we've done recently, the size of my desk, or even more, is the high temp solder. Any complex products, their circuit boards will have at least 2 to 5 high temp solder components on the board. You have 10 or 20 boards, you're looking at 100 of these. Listing every single one is pretty pointless because every single one is just an integrated circuit with high temp solder. So grouping them, and so you can group them. And so they use a lot of hand waving in theirs, and it comes back to this though. You have to be accurately described at the component level by the same generic name. So this is like your laptop or tablet, or it could be your IVD test equipment, referring to your brass components. They have to be described accurately by the same generic name, the brass components. A variety of people, especially in the data system, say, hey, you just export it from your BOM. Have you seen the names of parts in a BOM? This is the PWR ASSY 14G7 SD. That means nothing to the consumer. It means nothing to the recycling worker. Using the generic name is far more useful. Calling it a standoff, like, oh, that makes a lot more sense because that other stuff made no sense. And so describing accurately, and if you say, hey, it's internal part number P745, they'd be like, that still doesn't help. It's the brass standoff. Oh, okay, brass standoff, that makes sense. Or at least I could Google it. You can't Google your part number too easily, your internal part number. And so this is for grouping components that are internal to a product. If you sell the brass components separately and they have a separate SKU, and we'll talk, somebody asked questions about that, how you handle repairs and spares, you'd have it actually reference, you'd have its own listing referencing, believe it or not, the actual generic part. So as people describe the same generic name, and don't worry, I'll give examples. They have to have the same customs code, share the same SVHC, share the same materials code, it's pull down menu, and they have the same simple article. So a simple article is the legal requirement. That's part of the European Court of Justice ruling for 2015. It has to be at the part where, so legally, it's the first time it no longer requires a safety data sheet. So when it transfers from a powder or a liquid to a physical product. In reality, in practice, it's the component level. So a brass standoff, a resistor, components, a power supply, complex article made up of resistors and standoffs and wires and so on and so forth. That is a complex object, and that can't be grouped together as the final component. You'd have to have the brass component, the high temp solder in the power supply listed. It's actually one of the things we do all the time. We'll talk about the power supply, is whatever data you do get, we're a big fan of leveraging what you get and not be burdened by the mistakes in what you get and the gaps in it. So normally we create generic declarations that are based on the general case for that product. Here are all the declarable components, or and often the worst case. There's worst case and there's worst case, but basically reasonable worst case. This is what it is, and then you have all these 7 or 8 different types of SVHC containing components, and then if you do get data, search for these SVHCs, which would be different, and create solutions for them. Or if it's a simpler product and you only get so many SVHCs declared by your suppliers, instead export just the SVHCs that are declared and have a solution for each one. I mean, not every single line has its own unique solution. The idea is to create component templates where you can say, hey, that's a 6C, it's brass component, that's a 6C. You use the brass component template. This one used the brass component template. This one used the high temp solder template. Make it really easy. And then a handful are left over, figure out the solutions. A lot of times, and we looked at one the other day, it was about 10,000 lines of restricted materials for a single product, of which a good chunk of it was not correct, or way it was displayed was very difficult to handle in some cases. But what you realize, if you dug deeply, all you're doing is declaring how many times you have high temp solder, not the fact you have high temp solder. And now that's an optional field. And the fact you say you have 7 high temp solder incidents and then you actually have 11, there's no penalty for that. So much easier. And then instead we say, okay, why don't you search for EGDME, which is 1,4-dimethyloxoethane, search for D6, search for these things that aren't in the worst case. If you find one of them, then address it and add them back in. So instead of finding the extra value provided by your suppliers. Now, you're also going to have other problems. A lot of them will need solutions like they reported lead oxide, as we just talked about, that's leaded glass. That's an Na. So the bucket for that one, instead of a component template, is not applicable. Or we're going to see a lot nowadays imidazole and related families. These UV cure inks, they're just added in the last couple different updates. And what it is when the ink is cured, this agent breaks down and it actually drops, the chemical drops below the declarable level in the ink itself. But an ink is a chemical. It is not a declarable SVHC until it's painted or inked onto a surface. So whatever SVHC may be residual in it is measured over the weight of whatever it's painted on, and it makes its actual concentration irrelevant, way below 1,000 ppm, so not declarable. However, somebody back in the supply chain read it on a safety data sheet. It got communicated to the next one, who got communicated to the next one, got communicated to you, but it's not declarable in your product. So you're gonna have some solutions, and we'll talk about that later, on bucketing responses, whether you've tested it, which is by far the most accurate, but not possible in all situations, or done engineering evaluations, or you have supplier data. How do you solve it in a reasonable manner, leveraging any value you are provided and not be burdened by gaps? So they have the same SVHCs, share the same materials code, simple article. Good example we use all the time is brass standoffs. Brass components, brass standoffs, connectors, tubings, prongs, and other brass components. We use the generic customs code. Somebody mentioned earlier there are other options in there. Yeah, the generic brass parts have a lot of options. The new tariff codes will have more digits. However, you will likely still can use the upper digit ones. Basically, the way we do a customs code in the system is we choose a custom code, and then we start typing it in. And in a certain number of digits, you'll have only one option left, and we choose that one. So brass components, and we say subname, brass standoffs, connectors, tubings, prongs, and other brass components. Again, we're trying to be honest here. We're not trying to mislead anybody. When we're grouping these together, then describe it. And so this is one of the most effective ways to describe it to a consumer or a user or waste provider. If you describe it, yeah, it's part P72. Awesome, not helpful. It's the standoffs, connectors, tubings, and prongs. That's helpful. Guys about to recycle the product, it's not going to help too hot. Neat thing about this is, why does this system exist? In theory, in the law, it's so the waste provider can take a look at a product, say, hey, look, it's got a lead and brass standoffs. I got to be careful about that. Not how it's going to be used. The recycler has no interest, no economic interest in evaluating a product one at a time. It makes no economic sense. They just want to grind it up and separate it. However, the customs code is extremely useful, because what it starts telling them is saying, hey, you know what? We look at it, electronic products very commonly have this phthalate in them. So do we have to implement extra safety measures for our workers, recycling workers or other waste workers, because of the presence of phthalate or because of the lead? So it's be done at the customs code. One of the third use, and there are 4 by the way, the third use is consumers or a user can look it up in the system and go, hey, this product has lead in the internal components or brass components. Do I really want to buy it? So it gives the consumer information, especially in a consumer product where hopefully they can go from the barcode to the product in here. The fourth one, and probably one of the biggest ones, it's not what they promote, it's as an inventory of restricted materials for the EU Commission. So when you're looking at ROHS and they're looking at adding new substances, those substances were chosen because the chemical registration, so the registration of the liquid and powder versions of them, stated they had use in electronics. However, what they're finding is most of them don't have use in the final electronics. They're intermediate. Good recent one is nickel chloride. It dissolves in water. It's used in the electrolyte bath to do nickel plating. What's in the final product is not nickel chloride, it's the nickel plating. So nickel chloride didn't move any farther than ROHS or cobalt chloride because they're not on the final product. So right now, everything's limited by the uses described, the use descriptors in the chemical powders and liquids. This gives them instead by customs code, where are the restricted materials in products? And for the purposes of REACH restriction or ROHS or similar, where should we focus our effort? My goodness, this chemical is everywhere. You know what? Should we start looking at HDME or 1,4-dimethyloxyethane in button cell batteries? TNPP is startlingly, and it's a true thing actually, common in polybags. TNPP is one of the most common SVHCs actually. It's not in all polybags, it's probably in under 5%, but it's relatively, which if you see the number of polybags in the world, that's a lot. It's an antioxidant, so on the polybag or light-colored polyolefin heat shrink, so white or yellow heat shrink, when they're extruded, they can react with the oxygen in the air, and they need an antioxidant. And triinonylphenol phosphite is relatively common. Now, people say, well, it's only TNPP with over 0.1% nonylphenol. It always has over 0.1% nonylphenol. It breaks down in water into nonylphenol to a reasonable extent. So TNPP always has the nonylphenol. It can't get away without it. So TNPP is super common. We see it all the time. We see it almost every week here. It's polybags or the film. You're selling this wonderful system out in the world, and the screens are protected by this film, which you rip off when it's installed. That film often has TNPP. And sometimes the phthalates too. It's a nice, surprising little material. It's not the same as twist ties. Twist ties are the bugaboo of phthalates. Twist ties on the power cord almost never show up in the BOM, but people say it's a plastic twist tie. It's a flexible PVC twist tie with phthalates. We've seen some recalls in Canada. It's not public in the background where the problem was the SCCPs in the twist tie. So the brass components you can do. Metal components you can't do because you can't say standoff connectors, tubings, prongs, and other components made of aluminum, brass, and steel. They have a different customs code because of different materials. They're the same SVHC though, lead, and they're not the same materials category. Metal, aluminum, metal, brass, metal, steel are different pull downs. It's not the same. But there are simple articles. So there are limitations on what you can merge together. Aluminum, brass, and steel can't be merged together as a general. Now, theoretically, you could actually go instead tubing made of aluminum, brass, and steel. And that's actually somewhat feasible. Might not work in materials category, but you can get close. But in this case, you can't use this. Instead of saying aluminum components listing have a brass components component listing and a steel components listing, you can't merge those three together. They have a different customs code and the different materials codes. Another good example, people say from the BOM, I'm just going to take it right from the BOM. Well, you buy external power supply, you buy the whole thing. They declare a whole bunch of SVHCs. A power supply is not a simple component. You have to break it down further. So what you end up having to do, and most companies we work with have, instead of going back to the supplier, they have a solution path for when it occurs. If you get an assembly that declares this, this, and this is the components, worst case, we declare for it. So if it's power supply assembly that has lead, we're going to say lead and brass, lead and steel, and lead and high temp solder. And the thing about that, you're saying, well, is that really fair? Well, the funny thing is, in your product, you probably already have lead and brass, lead and steel, and lead and high temp solder. So it doesn't change your declaration anyways. So it's a perfectly valid way to do it. The reason you can't do it, of course, for power supply is it could be further dismantled into individual components. It can be pulled apart into wires, and it's not homogeneous materials. It's at the component level, not the homogeneous material. The wires or connectors or resistors are separate components. But what you end up doing is if you create a solution path for this, what you're going to find out is whatever the internal power supplies are declaring, the hard drive declared it too, and so did the circuit board. And it's just how many times you're declaring it. That's the nice thing about component grouping. Once you're declaring brass components, the how many of each is a field, but it's not a controlled field. So if you say 7 brass components, it turns out to be 9, there's no penalty for it, as long as you declare the brass components. I said brass components. I said my coffee machine had brass components with lead in it. That's the legal requirement. So like what we do for the coffee machine, which we did a webinar April 1st for this fellow, this light change now actually. So this coffee machine is a 12 cupper. It is a black, we'll say a red and a green version. It originally had to be done by UPC code. We'll talk about in the next one that the black, green, or yellow one, as long as they're the same SVHCs, containing components, can actually put all 3 here, but they have to list all 3 UPC codes. Professional products don't. They have a lot more leeway on how they list. So for example, we work for, say, a resistor manufacturer, which is not uncommon for us, and they have the LN47 series, just making that number up, and they're basically saying we can make 100,000 different variations of this, of which we sell 10,000 of them. But if somebody wanted to buy the other ones, we would. Doing 10,000 listings would be intense. We are a professional seller because we sell to someone else who then integrates it, even though it might be a consumer product. Where we sell it as a professional product, what they do instead is say in the LN74 series, all resistors where the 7th character is an L, and that describes accurately the range and scope. Customs codes, safe use instructions, we keep the safe use instructions, and anything technical at the component level. The only safe use instructions we keep at the product level are usually ones we've lifted directly from the current instructions for use, like don't dismantle the product, a whole bunch of things about battery safety. Anything that's already in the manual, we transport. And then down below, how many of each SVHC containing component has? Brass component, closed cell foam, which is ADCA, which is the 3rd most enforced SVHC, 5 silicone components, which would have D6. Do each one of those. And so instead it's a listing and then all the technical SVHC materials information in each side one of these components. Oops, sorry. And so we do the component ones. This is basically what it looks like. Here's a silicone component. It includes silicone components for silicone washers, gaskets, seals, tubes, wires, O-rings, and similar silicone components. There's the customs code. It's a bioaccumulant, so its safe use instructions are about disposal, not contact. It's candidate list version, so this was done to the first list of 2020. There's a second list now. However, that field is going away in the new version of iEuclid, but it's still in the current version, so we keep it in the sheet at least, so people have what to enter. It is dodecamethyl cyclohexosiloxane, which is D6, and there's a reason why they call it D6, because its real name is a doozy. Usually the real name is dechlorine plus. That's a super doozy. That's why they call it dechlorine plus. Dechlorine plus is easily the short form of its real name. Like BPA is definitely short form of its real name. But dodecamethyl cyclohexosiloxane is D6. Silicone is usually made from siloxane monomers like D6. D6 is in about 70% of all silicone components. If you actually look in the safety data sheet of the raw silicone before it's cured, it's usually well over 0.1%. But when it's cured, it does drop, but not to the same level, say that acrylonitrile drops in ABS or BPA drops in polycarbonate. They drop to like 10 ppm or lower. Silicone, the D6 monomer, drops somewhere between 500 and 1200 ppm, depending on the quality of the curing. So if you have the same say Elastosil silicone from Wacker, and you'll see it right in their safety data sheet, say 0.5%, 5,000 ppm, and you have 2 different suppliers making the same part, the D6 levels will be vastly different between the 2 of them. More often than not, they can be the same, but pure luck, because that final level is based on their curing process, not the original silicone. It's kind of a neat problem. Actually, there's a whole bunch of the newer SVHCs are like that. They're well above 0.1 in the chemical form. They're around 0.1 in the final form, and where they end up is related to the processing as opposed to the original material. So, about 75% of silicon components we test, we see D6 somewhere between 500 ppm and about 1200 ppm. So often enough, it pops over 1,000. And if you get 980 ppm, don't be too confident because it varies all the time. It depends on what today's curing was like. Concentration range, 0.1 to 0.3. If it's above 0.1, it's barely. And then the materials category is rubber and elastomer, silicone rubber. And then we have a different one for brass components, and we have another one for high temp solder. And so every product that has silicone components, if you don't know if it has D6, that you just refer to this. If you do know it has D6, you refer to this. And so it's a very simple bucket. Every time you see a silicone component, if you don't have an answer, you say it has the D6 in it. And you what end up at the end of the day is like, if I do more investigation, I'm going to find out I have 3 of them instead of 7. That doesn't matter. As long as I'm declaring the component and I have a decent approximation of how many, then I'm compliant. So no matter what you do, you're going to need these component templates. So we're a big fan. That we just looked as a component template. No matter what you do, you're going to need this, believe it or not. If you're testing it, you're going to need it. So we test for you. We say, you know what? You have lead and high temp solder, and you have lead and brass, and you have EGDME in the button cell battery. Awesome. That's not a SCIP declaration. A SCIP declaration is going to need one at the component level that says, you know, button cell batteries, it's customs code, the fact it's EGDME, it's an electrolyte, that template. Or we've done engineering evaluation where we review your product and say, you know, you have diodes with a 7A exemption, they're high temp solder. You need the high temp solder template, or you do data gathering, you get supplier data. You still need a solution path. And supplier data in particular needs a solution path because you're going to have good data, you're going to have bad data, and you're going to have confusing data. So often you'll get the supplier said, I have lead in my thick film resistors. That's actually leaded glass. We talked about that earlier. That's non-declarable SVHC. I have lead in my glass diode. Not declarable SVHC. I have lead exemption 7A, not 7C1, in my high temp solder, my diode. That is lead metal. That's lead alloy, not leaded glass. That's a declarable SVHC. So we'll use the high temp solder component template. I have an inrush current limiter, which is high temp solder. Same as the one above. We just use the high temp solder component template. I have a brass component with lead 6C. Awesome. We use the brass component template. I have heat shrink, which has the chlorine plus, which is a super common thin polyolefin or nylon plastic flame retardants. One of the drop-in replacements for Deca BDE. And it's actually on a path to be banned in Canada and the EU. So the chlorine plus in heat shrink, we'll use the heat shrink template. So the idea is have a solution path. And as you do more and more of these, you end up with fewer and fewer of the data points you're provided from testing or supplier data that don't have a solution path. Now, of course, when you do testing, anybody who wants the SCIP declaration with the test report, it's really easy to provide. Grouping of products. So we talked about grouping of components. So I have a coffee machine. I'm grouping my brass components together, and I'm grouping my high temp solder components together. But how can you group products together? I make a green, a red, and a black coffee machine. Can I group them in one listing? And this came from small, medium enterprise trade associations going, you know what, this would be a lot easier if we didn't have to list everything that's similar. Or like this product, we sell the exact same thing in the UK and France and Germany, but the packaging is different languages and we have to have a different power cord for UK, but they're the same thing. So can we just list them in the same way? Or, you know, we have a different, because of marketing, it has a different name on the package in Latvia. Group them all together. And so there is. Professional products have had a lot of leeway. Their ability to describe is much broader. Consumer products, they have less leeway. So if you merge the green, black, and red coffee machine together, you have to list the UPC code for those in a subfield. But you just put them in one listing. Professional products, you have to just be more descriptive. They would not normally even have UPC codes. It's like we talked about the resistor. It's the LN94 family with all the parts that the 7th character is an L. It's even harder for resistors because what you actually buy is not normally the resistor. It's the resistor in a bulk bag or resistor on a tape and reel. And there's different sizes of tape and reel, and it's quite complicated. So instead, they do it this family has this. And it's actually more applicable. In your BOM, you don't necessarily identify you got it on tape and reel or how you bought it packaging-wise. You just identify using this resistor. Now, you can group products together as long as they can be accurately described by the same common name. You say, you know, Advantage laptops. Well, I can't include the Pogo laptop because it's not the same name. Advantage laptops, and then you have the UPC codes if it's a consumer product or a descriptive range. It's this product and this product. It's the alpha, beta, and the delta products. They have to have the same customs code and the same SVHC containing components. Now, they may have different numbers of each SVHC. That's fine. The number of each SVHC containing component is not a control. But as long as they all have, or the worst case has, high temp solder, brass components with lead, etc., they have the same ones, they can be listed together. Now, you can't game the system. You still have to be honest. But if you can say, hey, the way it's described, somebody could understand it, it makes a lot of sense. And that's what we're doing. We give this example where it's basically saying, hey, the coffee machine, the green, red, and black one, all of the same declarables. They have the 2 closed cell foam, and they likely have the 5 D6 in silica. And that's worst case scenario. So whereas GPC code, they'd list all 3. Professional products is basically, if this was a different example, so you're making say something we did evaluation of last week, size of my desk, it's a water test handler. It has, like, you can get it with 1 robotic arm, 2 robotic arm, 3 robotic arm. You can get it with this, that, the other thing. They make a declaration for the worst case scenario and say it includes the AS21 water handler and all its variations, all its accessories, including robotic arms, etc. Be descriptive. Don't be dishonest. That's a key part. As long as you're honest, there's really no penalty for it. And they're just be happy it's in the system. Again, they're going to publish on their Twitter account, hey, now, X thousands of companies have registered in the system. We have this many products, and they're going to publicize that. Same way they did the chemical registrations for REACH. Now we have over 10,000 companies and over 100,000 chemicals and X number of submissions. They'll do that. They don't want to say, and the data is useless. That's not going to be in the tweet. I know this amount about marketing, they're not going to do that because that would hamstring their budget. They want to be able to promote it to justify the budget. Location. So they provide lots of examples. We say, hey, here's a car and an engine and then a water pump and then the O-ring. It's awesome. They'd love to have that, not required. Legally, it's just the car and the O-ring and the fact they're saying it's phthalates. I'm going to say it's the chlorine plus. It's not binding. Now they allow component grouping. Like, here's an example. We have 100 different bolts. Yeah, but they're going to be in all different locations. So the idea is to be honest, not deceiving, and identify the product, the component, and the SVHC. So I say, what they also go, hey, what you should really do, this would be awesome, is you go get the SCIP declaration file from each one of your suppliers and you link them into your file. Yeah, you haven't done this before, have you? That's my first comment. And it was like, and they always say, well, industry always says things are impossible. They always, they always complain. Fair enough. And their associations complain the most. And your own association will complain to you as much as them because they want to make it look like the sky is falling to justify their own work. But, so everybody's used to this. US Conflict Minerals provides a really concrete example where in US Conflict Minerals, it's a simple standard Excel form with data that you provide to each response. And what you do in the supply chain is gathering this standard, industry standard Excel form. And in year 1, they had about the companies that are draconian about it and really hammer on their suppliers had about a 50% success rate. In year 2, if they're really draconian, they had a 70% success rate. Still not what they wanted, what they would need for SCIP. So years from now, we'd still not be there. So it's not going to work with any of the current deadlines. Meanwhile, the SVHC communication system with all its bugs and gaps and data gaps and misleads and errors. Okay, there's a truthful part of this. When we test products for SVHC, the supplier declarations and what the SVHC is declarable in the final product are rarely related to each other. The lead and brass, sure, lead and high temp solder, most of the time, not all the time though, strangely enough. Often companies also identify the worst case scenario, and of course the modern one doesn't have it. But a lot of times they just don't control it properly. Lead is pretty easy to test for. A lot of these other ones are not, if people haven't spent the time or don't understand what they're doing or copying stuff from the last guy who made a mistake. It's like the worst telephone game ever in the chemical space. But at least the system's been around, and that's why we also recommend leveraging the advantages of it. Don't get burdened by the fact you can have data gaps and a lot of the data is not going to be correct. And a lot of people have no idea what they're doing. And a lot of this is linguistic and there's a lot of semantics, and that creates a lot more problems when you go to Asia. Asia is far more used to working with test standards. What's the test standard I have to work with? As opposed to something that has complicated semantics. That makes life difficult, like the lead glass thing we just talked about. That's complicated semantics. So don't get burdened by the fact that the SVHC system is not great, but at least something. And so when we're talking about process, we're a big fan of finding a really applicable way to do it. And we're very, very practical. Again, they're going to be counting how many products are in the system and how many companies are registered. And the main legal requirement is to register in the system. If there's something wrong with it, as we talked about before, they're more likely to say, hey, can you fix this next year? Or can you update this? That kind of thing. And the enforcement's by the member states. So simplified skip notifications, another new thing they talked about, just been there the whole time. So in REACH, not only is the manufacturer, but the distributor, everybody except for a consumer retailer, has to be communicate, the SVHCs, or be able to the next person in the chain. And the way they're doing this is instead of the distributors having to get your SCIP file, when you register for SCIP, a product, you're going to get a SCIP number for that product. They need to submit currently that number under their name also. They don't have to submit your file, they just have to submit your number. And so for everything they sell, they have to put the simplified SCIP number in. It's not well defined, and we can see distributors pushing back on this. But it's kind of how it works in their guidance. So if a company, Acme in the US, we'll say, imports a product that has declarable SVHCs, they have to have an EU entity register it. So the US side might have built the file, which is really straightforward to do, and the French division just uploads it. Then it covers the French and German and other divisions. They have all the same parent companies. They're all covered by one notification. But if they sell it to a distributor, the distributor has to put the number under their own listing. So they don't have to put your file, they just have to take your number. I can see a lot of pushback, see a lot of distributors like, you're gonna make me do what? Why? It's already in the system. So it's not likely to survive scrutiny by the distributors, but until then, distributors will be required to acquire the SCIP number for each product they sell. So they'll come to you and say, I am buying all these SKUs, I need the SCIP number by SKU. And some will be NA because there's no declarable SVHC. If there's no declarable SVHC, it doesn't have to go in the system. But they have to, so what you're gonna really want is, as you register, you're gonna wanna create, my recommendation right now, unless industry creates an industry standard file that everybody can upload, which makes way too much sense, but it's not gonna happen anytime soon, is have an Excel file with each product you sell and a SCIP number next to it. And hopefully have a single file that if anybody asks, you can just provide them that file. So, and that'll handle a lot of the requests. Now, some customers, unfortunately, will have a custom software system that they'll want you to hand type in each one, which doesn't sound very practical. But at least at a first level, you have a single Excel sheet that anybody asks for your SCIP numbers. You just give them the Excel sheet and you say, all our SKUs are in there, or all the things everything we sell. You just, anything you have to upload, identify what's the part number, and the SCIP number will be right there. And so you don't have to create custom responses for everybody who asks. You just have the one file you can just send back everything. It's a lot easier. So how do we do this? And of course, we talked about, we've done this for dozens and dozens of companies, for thousands of products. Not the registration yet because it's not open, but the file creation. Registration is pretty darn easy. When it opens, you just drag drop the files in. So first we start with this web demonstration. We establish the basics. We explain the rules, the process, and then we evaluate a representative product of yours. If it's small, often people send it to us, and we do it with cameras and show you, or if it's larger, they send us pictures, and hopefully the smart camera pictures, the smartphone pictures are actually incredibly high resolution, and we walk you through it. We move from left to right in each one of the pictures, and we talk about which one of the components can contain SVHCs and why, and which ones don't and why, or can't normally and reasonably. And we walk you through the entire product. Then we take any BOM or SVHC information and we augment the data. And then we create the product templates for you. So this is now we're going to create it for the AS 100 water system. And we're going to create the Excel version of the declaration because Excel is a lot more comprehensible by normal people. And then we'll pre-built the component templates. They're very technical, and attach them to the product declaration. So you have this product templates and these component templates in Excel, and then we'll create an IU-Grid file for it with you. This is how you do it. And we'll have the pre-built i6z files for the components, because the idea is the components of the templates are the Lego blocks. And all you're identifying with each product is how many of which Lego blocks are in it. And just click, click, and it's literally, once you put the Lego blocks, the component templates in your system, it's like, what's next on my Excel file? Brass component. Okay, click the brass component template. It enters my system. How many do you have? We'll say 5, and done. And then what's next? High temp solder. It's really straightforward to do. So we do the whole thing in just in a couple hours with you, and establish the process and create a declaration and give you all the documentation, complete at least for a product, and all the templates. And if from then on, you have the process. Now, we also have the same process, which is kind of handy. So a lot of companies are like, hey, we got this. We can do it ourselves. And they come back to us with questions every so often. I have a supplier declared this. What do I do with that? Oh, that's not a declarable SVHC, and this is why. Or, a good point, that is a variable resistor that actually uses, strange enough, a lead oxide. It counts as lead oxide, and here's the component template for it. Or other ones saying, you know what, we've established the tools and these guys have it, but this business unit just says, I just don't have the resources for this. So, but we've established the same process, so we can just do it for you. And you don't even have to commit what your plan is off the bat. Because once we have the same process as you, if you're set up to do it and you're more than able to do it, and we can help you whenever you need, or if you say, you know, this business unit or whichever, we just don't have the resources, we can do it for you. And it's straightforward because we've already established the process together. And then for registration, we can help you with that. You're going to find it relatively easy. Now, people ask, can you register for us? Yes, but you don't want that. You're going to want to own your own registration. So it's just a matter of one of your EU entities registering the system, and then you can do the work from anywhere. It's just, you're going to want to own your own password. It's just, we've done a lot of reach chemical registration. People eventually, at the end of the day, want to own their own password. But what we can do is have a web meeting where you're in the system and we just sitting over your shoulder helping you through it. And since they're prepackaged dossier I6Z files anyways, you just drag drop them in. And then we help you with anything that's not intuitive. But when you do that, you're going to get SCIP numbers, and you want to record the SCIP numbers by product because you might be asked, you're very likely going to be asked for them by distributors or everybody else later. And you want to basically be able, here's my Excel file of everything we sell, and here's the SCIP numbers for them. Or some people have a Reach SVHC declaration online. Why don't we just append the SCIP numbers for all the products at the end of it? So it's really the three phases. We want to establish the basics, get you the templates, product templates, have the technical component templates, create an IU good file, explain how to do it, do a whole product with you. And then depending on which way you go from then on, we'll support you as you do it, as needed, and as little or as much. If you got it all by yourself, then awesome. If you just need some questions, we can help you with that. Or we say, you know, this business unit, the one in Ohio, just doesn't have the resources. We've all agreed upon the process. We can just do it for them. And then registration. You're going to want to register yourself because you're going to own the password. But we found we can just web meeting in behind you and be over your shoulder and help you with anything you don't understand. So that's how we do a lot of it. Obviously not registration yet because system isn't open until at least October, if not a touch later. So laboratory testing, especially for new products, is one of the easiest ways to solve it. I have a new product I want to get to market. I'm selling all over the world. I just need to be compliant. It's the simplest cookie cutter way to do it. You get it done in weeks. You don't have to worry about everything complicated, and it's done right. Monthly or quarterly updates, well, like we're doing today, we're going to explain something, what's changed, like the new 4 SVHCs and why they're not going to be in your product, and why some people disagree on one of them, and why the 5th one didn't make it, and the fact that we'll probably make it in about 2 years, and why that all is. And then talking about the new Canadian restricted materials and with the restriction coming in for PFOA in this month in EU, where we're finding it in the lab, what parts are non-compliant. And then you ask questions about, well, my customers ask about this. Oh, okay, this is what they really mean, and explain it to you. It's very, very interactive. Sometimes, you know what, we could really use some knowledge on biocides. Can you include in your update explanation of the EU biocides? Sure, we'll include that next month. So we don't understand which is, by the way, perfectly reasonable. Sure, we'll explain and the difference between the product requirements and the importation sales requirements related to and we'll explain all that. And then, of course, what we're talking about today, SCIP web demonstration is the best cookie cutter way to do it. We've done it for dozens of companies. We've done it, create SCIP declarations for thousands of products. We've walked a lot of companies, all even through phase 2, not just phase 1. Okay, so they come back and I have this situation. Sure, this is the answer for it. Or it's like, this division can't really do it. They just don't have the resources. How much will you guys do it? So, and we can do it for them. And we're all using the same process, so everything matches, which I really, really like. So if you need support, just contact us. You can even just respond to there'll be an email after this with a copy of the presentation and such. Feel free to respond to that or email us directly. We're really happy to help. It's actually kind of fun for us. Unfortunately, it's kind of exciting and fun sometimes for us. We know a lot about the materials, so I guarantee you're going to learn stuff. Sometimes unfortunate things about the world you live in, but it's quite interesting. It's very interactive. We do demonstration. We find PowerPoint awesome, wonderful, not very tangible all the time. So we'd rather have your product and walk you through. You know what we're talking about? This TNPV, trinonyl phenol phosphate. See that film right there? That's the material in that picture. that can have it. This is why. You know what the high temp solder parts look like? Here's one. This is what they look like. It looks like this. And zoom in the circuit board. It looks like this guy. And the guy next to it is a thick film resistor. It'll have leaded glass, not declarable. And this is what it looks like. But walk you through left and right, and we're talking, hey, here's the ABS frame, and it's not declarable for SVHCs because of these reasons, and so on and so forth. So it's very, very tangible, and we create the templates for you, and then the IUCLID file. So if you have any questions, and this morning they had a lot, and I didn't get to everybody's because we're talking interpretations. I'm speaking a little bit quickly. Fortunately, this will all be recorded and available online and in YouTube, which means you can slow it down to reasonable humans. My mom is mortified how fast I speak. Yeah. But the nice thing is you can scroll back. So hopefully not all my words in one sentence become a single word. It's kind of handy, a lot more tangible. We at one point in time, this British fellow who works with us, wonderful gentleman. The first time we slowed it down, you heard in the background, he's like, oh, I finally understand what he's saying. So that was pretty funny, I think, at least for everybody else. Okay, SCIP database can only be managed by EU-based companies. Is that correct? Yes and no. So the SCIP database is two different sections. It's the file creation, which anybody can do. My kids literally can log into the system and create files. Anybody can create the I6Z file. The registration itself has to be by an EU entity, but it's literally drag drop into their system. They can literally, you can actually email them a folder of files. They can drag it, drop it into theirs, and it's perfect. Are medical devices required to comply with SCIP? Yep. Everything's in scope because it's a declaration. Now, okay, step back. There are a couple of things that aren't in scope because the EU has no control over them. So items for national security, military, police, do not have to register in the system if they choose not to, but that's a decision really of the police. But for a lot of reasons, the EU does not control the national security of the member states. And things that go into space, they say that's not going into Europe, that's going in space. So outside of those two, everything else is in scope, yes. Still has to be physical products. Chemicals, liquids, and powders are handled through the normal chemical registration system. But medical devices are in, control monitoring, brooms, mops, everything. Everything's in scope. I make a system that does the x-rays at the airport. Yep. I make the air conditioner for the whichever convention system. Yep. I make the windows for that convention system. Also, yes, everything's in. Ink with SVHCs. If I understand you correct, mention that the lowest article is not the ink, but the product which the ink is printed on. Yes, so I'll talk about legally. Legally, and if you had to really fight in court for sure, it's the stage where it no longer requires a safety data sheet. So ink has a safety data sheet until it's inked onto the surface. Then any SVHC residual in the ink is measured over whatever surface or item was inked on. Page 30 in the guidance on articles from ECA is a really good example of you painting on a surface. So they have a product they paint on a powder coat, in a lot of cases. Most powder coating is TGIC, which is pretty aromatic, so there's not a lot left in the final version, but theoretically be over 1,000 ppm of the paint, but that TGIC in the paint is measured over the weight of whatever it's painted on and drops well below 0.1%. So it's actually in the ECA's REACH guidance on articles. It's around page 30. Okay, it's on page 30. And you can see the justification for why ink or paint, any SVHC in it, is measured over the weight of the components painted or inked on. It's not homogeneous material. It's quite different than ROHS. Is an object subject to both ROHS and SCIP? Is that double regulation? Ooh, this is somebody who knows something. That's really cool. So the EU attempts strongly not to double regulate. So often there's a REACH restriction for a chemical if it's under ROHS. Products under ROHS are exempted by it, or say medical devices, because they have their own regulation to control substances. This is not a restriction, it's a declarable, so therefore it's not double regulation from their point of view. It's like they can have substances restricted in chemicals, and they also have the requirement to register those chemicals. It's not double regulation, because this is the disclosure as opposed to a restriction. It's a really good question. Large products, professional printing press will not go to waste the whole. Instead, various parts will fail and be replaced. Thus, only these subparts will show up as waste management. Any insight we expect in this scenario? So, fortunately, this is what's placed in the market. They don't really, ROHS cares about waste. This one does not. So they only care about what's being sold. Now, there's a much more complicated topic. So everything related to that system is in scope. but it's only in scope if placed on the market after January 5th, 2021. So if you have a unit, not a model, a unit that's been placed in the market in 2020, that unit does not have to be, it was imported to the EU before Jan 5th, 2021. That unit does not require to be in the SCIP database, and any spares or repairs or upgrades to that unit are also out of scope because their placed on the market date is related to the unit they're repairing or upgrading. So it's also one of the things, well, do we have to put in our spare and repair parts? Yes. Now, year one, you can also justify their insider main declarations, but it's another illegal shenanigans there is the fact that any spare repair for units that are obsolete are obviously out of scope because they're placed in the market date before Jan 5th, 2021. And if you're bringing replacements or spares, say in first half of next year, they're very unlikely to be for new products placed in the market that year. They'd be repairing old ones. So you can justify, yes, we will get our spares and repairs into the system in year two. But in year one, anything we're replacing or upgrading is out of scope because the products they're repairing or upgraded were placed in the market in previous years. So that's a big complicated one. It's a bit of a longer one. Do you use the customs code for the part itself, or you do code from part of something else, such as the part of a machine? So it depends what you're declaring. If you're declaring the coffee machine, it's the customs code for the coffee machine. If you're declaring brass components, it's the customs codes, which is more than one, for brass components. It's basically whatever you're describing as the name, that thing. Product doesn't have any SVHCs in it. Do you have to register it in the SCIP database? Absolutely not. Now, it's almost impossible to have an electronic product without it. Not impossible, just very unlikely. But there are products that won't have SVHCs. The one bugaboo that's gonna, if people have good data, which I won't say they do, the fact that TMPP is pretty common in poly bags is going to upend a lot of SCIP declarations. SCIP listing required for a product importer for own use. If there's no recipient, no. It's only to be provided as a recipient. Do you have to be physically located in the EU to actually register a product in the database? The registered entity does. If they provide the software password to you in the US or somewhere else, you can do it from there. But the entity that's attached to it has to be inside the European Union. And if you don't have one, it might end up, you can actually get a legal arrangement with somebody else, but very commonly it's your distributor. Are aerospace products covered? Yes, except, big except, national security has exemptions for it, as does things that go into outer space. National security items are not in it, but civil aviation is. Now, there's an interesting thing with civil aviation. Is the plane actually placed on the market in the EU? That's an interesting question. I've seen that debated many times. But aerospace is only out of scope if it's military or outer space. Now, of course, if it's a plane from the US that just travels in and out, that doesn't count either. It has to be sold or transferred ownership. For components that I purchased, do I need to register in the SCIP database or only get the SSN number from my supplier? Depends what it is. If it's a part that goes in your product, it's your product that has to be registered. If you're selling something with your product, like a Dell desktop, you're basically a distributor. You just have to put the SSN number under yours. What are the penalties for not meeting registering SCIP? You can't sell in Europe. That's it. It has to be in there, otherwise you can't sell. Or you can justify that it doesn't have to be in there, which actually creates a little bit of a confusing situation because things might not be in there because they don't have to be. But it's the main requirement to sell in Europe is to be in the system. Errors in your declaration, especially if they're good faith, are not the same thing. So the stop ship is around, unless you get a million warnings, is around being in the system or not the quality of your declaration. So again, I went way over time. Thanks again, everybody. Pleasure hosting everyone today, and I look forward to hosting everyone again soon.